Redditor 1. I was 7 years old the first time they came through my wall. Well, not exactly the first time I actually remember them coming through my wall. That small distinction is crucial because so much of what happened those nights lives in a blurred space between memory and nightmare, between what I know occurred and what my mind insists couldn't be real. And yet, I recall that very first night with the clarity of the split second before a car crash or the moment just before you tumble downstairs. My bedroom was on the second floor of our unremarkable suburban home in Vermont. It wasn't special. Pale blue walls, a ceiling dotted with glow-in-the-dark stars, and a bookshelf crammed with Goosebumps novels and science encyclopedias. The east-facing window offered a view of our backyard maple and then the endless woods beyond. I had always been an anxious child, prone to lying awake long past bedtime, watching shadows creep across the ceiling and imagining unspeakable things hiding in my closet. But that night was different. The terror wasn't a product of my imagination. It came from something more primal, something my body sensed even though my mind couldn't yet understand. It began with a pressure in my ears, reminiscent of the feeling when you're ascending a steep mountain. Then, the air in my room shifted, growing heavier, charged with static that made every hair on my arm stand on end. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked, 3:17 a.m. I lay there rigid under my Star Wars blanket, straining my eyes to survey every corner of my room, the walls, the ceiling, the closet door, the window, my gaze darting frantically in a pattern I would later perfect in terror. And then I saw it. The wall beside my dresser rippled. It was as though someone had dropped a stone into a still pond, but vertically. Concentric circles of motion spread outward, and in the center, something began to emerge. They were diminutive, perhaps only 3 feet tall, with limbs so slender it seemed impossible for them to support the massive heads that dominated their forms. Their skin wasn't skin at all. It resembled a perfectly smoothed, textureless modeling clay. No wrinkles, no pores, no trace of underlying muscle. Just a uniform, malleable gray. But it was their eyes that have haunted me ever since. Not the typical movie-style oval black eyes. These eyes curved around the sides of their heads, reminiscent of a wasp's compound vision rather than any mammalian trait. There was no emotion, no readable intent, only a blank, all-seeing presence meant solely to observe, record, process. That night, 3 of them emerged. They moved with an eerie efficiency, like automatons on an assembly line, purposeful yet devoid of personality. Their long, spindly fingers reached for my wrist. Their touch was neither warm nor cold, just there. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even move. Terror had locked my throat and frozen my limbs. They guided me through the wall, a sensation I can only liken to walking through a thin, cold membrane of water while staying completely dry and into somewhere else entirely. The room they brought me to was utterly plain, featureless. No doors or windows, only smooth walls that seemed to absorb every bit of light. They seated me on something that might have been a table or part of the floor rising up to meet me. One of them ran its impossibly long fingers up my spine, meticulously counting vertebrae, as if reciting beads on a rosary. That's when she appeared. She was different from the others. Taller, perhaps 6 feet, with sharper, more defined features, though still distinctly alien. While the smaller figures felt mechanical, she exuded a presence, a will. When her insect-like eyes met mine, I felt as though her consciousness invaded my mind. It was as if another mind had flooded my thoughts, rearranging them like seeds scattered in fertile soil. "We are grateful for your help," her voice resonated inside my head, even though no mouth moved. "You are indispensable to our project." I longed to ask what project that was, to scream for my parents, to wake from what I assumed must be a nightmare, but her will smothered mine, drowning my thoughts before they could even form. "Don't tell anyone about us," she continued. "They can't see us, they'll only be upset." She attempted to make it sound like I was special, as if a teacher were praising a student for scrubbing the blackboard after class. But I didn't want to be special. I didn't want to be chosen. I simply wished to be safe in my bed, under my Star Wars blanket. Then she said something that would haunt me for years. Don't create too much trash. People will fall ill. Stop cutting down so many trees. It wasn't the literal message that disturbed me. It was the implication. These beings, whatever they were, weren't merely studying us. They were genuinely concerned about our behavior, about what we were doing to ourselves, to our planet. The thought that something so utterly alien could worry about humanity was far more terrifying than any invasive probe or experiment. That first encounter established a pattern. Sometimes weekly, sometimes separated by months, each visit began with that same pressure in my ears and a charge in the air. Always the little ones first, then her. Always that overwhelming violation when she slipped into my mind. I eventually developed coping strategies. I'd lie awake for hours, desperately trying to watch every surface simultaneously until exhaustion claimed me, hoping that if I slipped into a deep enough sleep, they wouldn't come. It never worked. These visits persisted throughout my childhood into my early teens. They left no physical scars, no marks, implants, or unaccounted for gaps in my time, just the memories, the fear, and the crushing awareness of something no one would ever believe. When I was 11, I discovered an alien abduction book in the library. Reading it was like finding the key to a locked door. I finally knew I wasn't crazy. Others had seen them too. Others had experienced the cold, efficient grays and their mind-probing tall figure. I learned they could slip through walls, that they were not only here to study us, but were worried about our self-destructive behavior. For 3 days after that, I was in shock. Comforted that I wasn't alone, but equally terrified that no place was truly safe, that walls and locks were meaningless. As a teenager, I became obsessed with researching alien abduction stories. I could instantly distinguish genuine accounts from fabrications. The true accounts never described the grays with human-like features. No wrinkles, no visible muscles, no expressions. Just descriptions of cold, unfeeling biological machines tasked with inexplicable missions. The visits abruptly stopped when I turned 15, as suddenly as they began. Yet the effects lingered. I developed what some call post-abduction disorder, a condition you won't find in any manual. I still check every nook of my room before I sleep. I still shudder at the sight of needles, terrified they might touch my bone. I still experience that deep, primordial fear when I see insects, especially wasps with eyes that seem all too familiar. In my 20s, I sought therapy for depression. During one particularly intense session, I finally allowed myself to recount those nights in full, shaking so violently that my therapist had to guide me through breathing exercises before I could drive home. I know how this must sound. If anyone else read these words, they'd likely dismiss it as sleep paralysis, night terrors, or an overactive imagination fueled by too many sci-fi novels. Perhaps it was childhood trauma wearing an alien mask. Maybe it was something else entirely. But here's what I know. When I experience sleep paralysis, it fades on waking, becoming a vague, less threatening memory. These memories, however, remain as vivid as ever. The sensation of those long fingers along my spine, the pressure of her consciousness pressing into mine, the way the wall rippled like water as they passed through. I don't believe they were extraterrestrials in the conventional sense. Given the physics of faster-than-light travel, interstellar visitors seem highly unlikely. Sometimes I suspect they might be interdimensional beings slipping between layers of reality like we move from room to room. Other times, I wonder if they're manifestations of our collective unconscious. Archetypal forms materialized by our shared guilt and fears about what we're doing to our planet. Mostly, though, I try not to think too hard about what they might be. Any explanation I devise seems woefully inadequate. How do you rationalize something that exists beyond our known limits? I'm now 42. I have a successful career, a loving partner, and a life that most would consider normal. I haven't seen the grays in nearly 3 decades. Yet sometimes, late at night, I still feel that pressure in my ears, notice the air charged with static, and find myself scanning the walls, waiting for that unmistakable ripple. My partner dismisses it as being a light sleeper, unaware why I check every corner of our bedroom before switching off the lights, or why I sometimes wake at exactly 3:17 a.m., eyes darting between walls, ceiling, and closet. Last week, I saw a wasp building its nest under our eaves. There was something about its precise mechanical movements, its eyes catching the light, that transported me back to when I was 7, feeling those alien fingers on my wrist, hearing her disembodied voice. I've never fully told this story, only fragments, even to my therapist. I'm not drawn to support groups or UFO conventions, nor do I believe in government cover-ups or conspiracies. I simply know what happened, and what continues to haunt my nightmares. Sometimes I wonder about the other children they visited. Do they grow up burdened with the same terror, the same vivid memories, the same inability to feel safe in their own homes? Do they lie awake, watching the walls, recalling the sensation of alien fingers counting their vertebrae? And in my darkest moments, I can't help but wonder if she was right to worry about us, about our waste, our environmental destruction, our relentless march towards self-destruction. Maybe the true horror isn't that they visited, but that they had reason to be concerned. Because those eyes, those insectoid eyes that wrapped around their heads, saw everything, and what they saw made them care enough to bridge the gap between their world and ours, to touch our reality with long gray fingers, and to plant warnings in our minds like tiny I still keep the old Star Wars blanket from my childhood room, carefully stored in a cedar chest in the attic. Sometimes I pull it out, run my fingers over its faded design, and remember how it failed to protect me on those nights when the walls rippled like water. And sometimes, in the deep silence of night when the house feels heavy with possibility, I secretly hope they return. Not because I long to see them again, God no, but because now I have questions, grown-up questions. Why me? What exactly was their project? Are they still watching as we continue to self-destruct? Mostly I hope they come back, because the alternative is far worse, that they've simply given up on us. As I write this, the clock on my nightstand reads 3:16 a.m. The air is thick, my ears are popping, and the wall beside my dresser. Is it my imagination, or did it just ripple once more? Editor 2. Growing up as the daughter of an experimental flight test engineer at Edwards Air Force Base made my childhood uniquely different. While most kids dreamed of princesses and dragons, I drifted off to sleep listening to stories about breaking the sound barrier and watching experimental aircraft slice through the desert sky. But there was one story my father never meant for me to hear, a secret that spilled out one night when the whiskey loosened his tongue. I was home from college one weekend, sitting with him on our back porch in Lancaster. The night was clear, and far off, the glow of the base's lights pierced the dark horizon. Though he had retired 3 years earlier, his eyes still often wandered toward Edwards whenever we sat outside. "You remember all those times I took you out to the dry lake beds?" he asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I nodded. Those days were magical. Watching test flights from safe distances, examining the scattered remains of long-abandoned projects on the cracked lakebed like relics from a bygone era. "The rocket rail was always your favorite," he recalled, referring to the massive track we'd visited countless times. "But there was one night in '97, something happened out there that wasn't in any test plan." He had never mentioned it before. Leaning forward in the soft porch light, I watched his face grow somber. "We were running night tests on a new prototype. I can't divulge details, it's still classified, but it was unlike anything we'd ever encountered. The design was unconventional. Some of the engineers even joked that it looked more alien than man-made." He took another slow sip. That night, conditions were perfect. Clear skies, no moon, virtually no civilian traffic. Our test pilot, James Mitchell, a good man who'd flown in Desert Storm, was set for his first full-speed run. Everything checked out during pre-flight. Normal takeoff, but once the craft reached test altitude, something changed. The sensor readings went haywire, and the craft began pulling maneuvers that defied logic. Maneuvers that should have been fatal. Mitchell's radio went dead. His hands trembled as he continued. Then we saw the lights. Not the lights on our craft, but 3 distinct, bright points moving in formation with it. They hadn't registered on radar or triggered any alarms. They simply appeared. Astonishingly, our prototype began mirroring their movements exactly as if it were reflecting them. When we finally regained radio contact, Mitchell was disoriented, repeating coordinates in a voice that just didn't sound like his. Those coordinates pointed to one of the smaller, rarely used dry lake beds. For 12 long minutes, we lost all tracking data. When the systems finally came back online, the prototype was sitting calmly on the lake bed, completely intact but icy cold to the touch. Mitchell was found unconscious in the cockpit, and when he awoke, he had no memory of the landing. My father fell silent for a moment, then added, "The next day, they scrapped the entire project, data wiped, materials disposed of. Mitchell took early retirement and moved to Alaska. Officially, no one ever acknowledged what happened." "But here's the strangest part," he whispered. "A week later, while reviewing footage from our perimeter cameras, I discovered a gap exactly 12 minutes long. When I slowed down the last frame before the gap, I saw something." He fumbled with his phone and then handed it to me. The grainy still showed nothing more than the dark expanse of the dry lake bed, until I noticed a pattern in the hard pan, visible only in infrared. It was a perfect circle, roughly half a mile in diameter, etched with intricate geometric shapes that shifted and morphed the longer I stared. "That pattern vanished the very next day," he said softly. "But since then, every few years, pilots report instrument failures right over that spot. Compasses spinning out, radios dead, GPS signals lost. And sometimes, if you're out there at night..." He trailed off, staring into the glass. "What happened?" I pressed. "Sometimes you see lights down on the lake bed," he explained in a hushed tone, as if something below is drawing those same precise patterns with laser-like precision. The brass always dismisses it as atmospheric phenomena or tests of some new ground illumination. But I know every project that went through Edwards in my time. There was never an illumination system capable of what I witnessed." He poured himself another measure, but didn't drink it. "I retired because I couldn't continue working, knowing what I knew while having to pretend everything was normal. Some of the experimental planes we built, maybe we weren't the only ones doing the experimenting." He made me promise never to share his story. Yet last week, while driving past Edwards on a late-night detour near that abandoned dry lake bed, my car's GPS went haywire. I saw lights dancing over the hard pan, drawing patterns that pulsed with an eerie logic. I quickly turned around, but in my rearview mirror, I swear I saw something rising from the lake bed, something resembling that prototype, except this time, it wasn't one of ours. My father passed away last year, taking his secrets to the grave. Still, on clear nights, I sit on my porch watching the distant glow over Edwards, wondering how many of those experimental flights were truly ours, and how many were attempts to mimic something already out there. A dance of lights across ancient, dust-covered lake beds, holding more secrets than we're ever ready to learn. Predator 3. The worst part wasn't the nightmares, nor the missing chunks of time, or even the strange lights that sometimes flit in the corner of my vision. The most agonizing part was that I once had physical proof, tangible, undeniable evidence, and I let it slip away down a bathroom drain when I was 12. I've never shared this account on social media or UFO forums. Who would believe me? But lately, with the dreams intensifying, I feel compelled to write it down, even if only to prove to myself I'm not losing my mind. It all began with a persistent itch in my left earlobe. Nothing dramatic at first, just a minor irritation that made me subconsciously reach up to scratch it throughout the day. One evening at dinner, my mom noticed and assumed it was some earring infection, even though I'd never had my ears pierced. A week later, I felt something else, a hard, round object beneath the skin. When I pressed my fingers against my earlobe, I could feel it roll slightly, like a tiny ball bearing lodged under the surface. My mom insisted it was probably just a pimple or a cyst. "Totally normal for someone your age," she said. But I knew my own body, and this felt different. The school nurse echoed her sentiments during a visit. "It's just an under-the-skin pimple, honey. Apply some tea tree oil." But pimples don't feel like metal. They don't pulse or shift as if they were alive. It stayed with me for 6 long months. 6 months of constant awareness. lying awake at night with that strange presence in my ear, catching fleeting glimpses of odd lights through my bedroom window, and waking up with my pajamas disheveled. Then the dreams began, if they could even be called dreams. I'd find myself lying on something cold and flat, under an intense brightness with shadows dancing just out of reach. There was a high-pitched hum, an electronic feedback, followed by a sensation in my ear as if something were being inserted with unnerving precision. I'd wake up tangled in my sheets, my heart pounding, and the object in my ear would seem to pulse in rhythm with my... After half a year of this torment, I finally couldn't take it anymore. One Saturday morning, when my parents were out shopping, I resolved to extract the object myself. Looking back, I realized how foolish and dangerous it was, but at 12, I believed I was invincible. I gathered my supplies, a sewing needle, rubbing alcohol, cotton balls, and my mom's hand mirror, and locked myself in the bathroom. I sterilized everything as best I could, drawing on what I'd absorbed from watching medical shows. The needle's prick hurt, and blood gushed immediately, far more than I'd anticipated, but I barely registered the pain. I was focused on the sensation of the hard, round object sliding beneath my skin toward the incision I had made. I squeezed upward, forcing it toward the opening, my fingers slick with blood. When it finally emerged, I nearly dropped it. It rolled across my palm, leaving a thin trail of red. It was a perfect black metal sphere, smaller than a BB, adorned with an indentation around its equator, and a surface pocked with uniform tiny dimples. My hands trembled as I held it up to the light. The metal absorbed the light instead of reflecting it, and it felt warm, not from my body heat, but as if it were generating its own energy. I set it on the edge of the sink to clean off some blood, and that's when it happened. The sphere inexplicably rolled on its own, tracing 2 perfect circles around the sink's perimeter before disappearing down the drain with a quiet plink. I screamed in frustration and plunged my hand into the drain, but it was gone. When my parents returned, they found me sitting on the bathroom floor, tears streaming down my face with blood on my hands and shirt. I tried to explain, but they were too furious about my reckless stunt to listen. My dad cleaned my ear while my mom lectured me about not popping pimples with needles. That was 15 years ago. After that incident, the nightmares subsided and the strange lights became less frequent. I graduated high school, went off to college, started a career, normal, everyday life. Yet, I've never stopped wondering about what I lost down that drain. Last month, I felt a similar itch in my right earlobe. When I pressed on it, I sensed something hard and round beneath the skin. I promptly made an appointment with a doctor. They performed an X-ray, but nothing showed up. The doctor suggested it was probably just a cyst. But then, last night, I saw lights outside my window again, and this morning I discovered my pajamas were inexplicably on inside out. This time, I won't attempt self-extraction. I've bought a strong magnet and a glass jar, and I've even installed cameras in my bedroom. Whatever this thing is, or whatever is happening to me, I refuse to let the proof vanish again. Yet sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel that original implant somewhere in the sewers, sending its silent signals into the dark. And I wonder, what if it isn't trying to communicate with something above us? What if it's reaching out to something below? P.S. If you ever feel a similar anomaly under your skin, please don't repeat my mistake. See a doctor, get scans, and document everything. Don't let desperation push you toward dangerous self-surgery. If you do discover something inexplicable, you'll want solid proof, and you'll want to be prepared for what follows. Editor 4. I first noticed a small dark spot on my thigh in early March, a tiny freckle that barely contrasted with my pale skin. I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another sign of getting older, like the first gray hairs or the occasional crack in my knees. But freckles don't change, not like the way this one did. By May, it had developed a strange indentation in its center, resembling a miniature volcanic crater. The skin around it felt different too, firmer, almost waxy. I found myself absent-mindedly running my fingers over it during meetings, probing its edges while watching TV, each day becoming more aware of its presence. I'd had skin issues before, teenage acne and occasional cyst, but this was different. When I pressed around it, I could feel something solid beneath the surface, as if a tiny ball bearing had somehow become trapped under my skin. My rational mind urged me to schedule a dermatologist appointment, but with a 3-month waiting list and a nagging unease that this was something altogether wrong, I hesitated. It felt alien, like it didn't belong on my body at all. Last night, I finally broke. After hours of restless tossing, unable to sleep because I could feel it pressing against my pajama fabric, I went to the bathroom. I told myself I'd only take a closer look or maybe clean the area. In truth, I lied to myself. I had prepared meticulously, sterilized tweezers, antiseptic wipes, gauze, and bandages, all arranged before I admitted what I intended to do. Under the harsh bathroom light, I examined the spot in the mirror. Had it grown? The indentation seemed deeper than before. When I pressed around the area, something beneath shifted, not like a movable cyst, but deliberately, as if the object was adjusting its position. The first squeeze hurt more than I expected. Not merely a surface prick, but a deep, burning pain that radiated upward. And then I saw it. A dark, perfectly round object beginning to emerge from the split in my skin. My hands trembled as I clutched the cold tweezers, trying to grip whatever lay beneath. That's when I felt it move again, not because I pressed harder, but as if it were shifting on its own. The pain intensified, but I couldn't stop. I had to know what it was. With another squeeze, the skin split further, and suddenly there it was, a perfect black sphere, larger than I'd imagined, about the size of a small marble. Its surface was smooth and oddly reflective, resembling polished hematite, too perfect to be a natural growth. I carefully placed it into a small glass vial I'd rescued from my sister's bead collection. The cut on my leg began bleeding, but not profusely. The edges were unnaturally clean, almost surgical. After bandaging the wound, I noticed something peculiar in the mirror. On my other thigh, about 6 inches above my knee, a new small black spot had appeared. A tiny freckle, just as inconspicuous as before. Now, as I write this, the sphere sits on my desk inside its glass prison. Late at night, in the silence, I sometimes swear I can hear it. A faint, high-pitched frequency, barely audible at the edge of hearing. And if I glance at it from the corner of my eye, it seems to have shifted its orientation, as if acknowledging a sibling still hidden beneath my skin. I know I should have it analyzed by a doctor, but every time I think of it, that soft hum grows louder and an inexplicable reluctance grips me. For now, I've taken to checking my body obsessively. So far, I've discovered 3 such spots, all tiny and seemingly harmless, at least for now. Maybe tomorrow I'll take it to a doctor and have it examined, but tonight I simply watch it, and sometimes I swear it watches back. P.S. If you find something similar on your skin, please don't follow my lead, see a professional. Because what if it isn't trying to emerge, but merely shifting to a new place within you? Redditor 5. Summer nights in the Utah mountains have a way of making you feel small, insignificant against a vast, ancient landscape. I learned that lesson back in 2012 when I was 16 and thought I had all the answers. Now, 10 years later, I'm not so sure about anything, especially about what happened that night near Springville. There were 4 of us, me, Jake, Marcus, and Chris. We'd been camping in these mountains since childhood, usually with our families, but this was our first time out on our own. 4 teenagers, a canvas tent, and enough junk food to last us a nuclear winter. We felt invincible. We set up our tent in a small clearing about 2 miles above the valley, far enough from any trail to avoid other campers. It was the perfect spot for 4 high school sophomores to feel as if we ruled the world. About an hour into our stay, while we were devouring a bag of Doritos and chatting idly, Marcus suddenly fell silent mid-sentence. Through the heavy canvas we saw it, a light, brilliant enough to pierce the fabric as if it were paper. Probably a helicopter, Chris muttered, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. We unzipped the tent and scrambled out in a panic, nearly tripping over one another. The light hung in the sky above the valley, too low for a plane, too steady for a helicopter. It was as if someone had suspended a tiny sun in the middle of the night. "Holy shit," Jake whispered. None of us moved, not even breathed. The light simply lingered, watching us. After what seemed like an eternity, though in reality probably only 30 minutes, it began to move, not like an aircraft, but in a smooth gliding motion, as if a droplet of water were sliding down a window. It descended slowly into the valley, its glow illuminating the mountainside and casting long, eerie shadows among the trees. I'd like to say we acted like heroes, but we didn't. We only managed to curse in terrified whispers. Jake and Marcus even grabbed BB guns from the tent, useless in the face of what we were witnessing, and waved them nervously. "Get out of here," Chris shouted, his voice echoing over the valley. "We see you." The light paused, hovering roughly 1,000 feet above the valley floor. For another half hour, we stood frozen, our initial panic shifting into a morbid fascination. Then it happened. The light split into two perfect spheres, so seamlessly it looked like a cell dividing under a microscope. For a moment, they hung there, identical and radiant. Then each developed a halo of blue flame-like energy, reminiscent of St. Elmo's fire, but imbued with a purpose. In an instant, they shot off in opposite directions, leaving trails of blue light etched into our retinas. One darted east toward the higher peaks, the other west toward the Great Salt Lake. Then they were gone, leaving us in darkness so complete it felt as though we'd been blinded. None of us slept that night. We huddled in our tent, startled by every sound, clutching our BB guns even though we knew they were futile. At sunrise, we tried to convince ourselves it had all been a military test, or perhaps a rich man's drone experiment, anything to make sense of what we'd seen. But for the entire following week, those mysterious lights reappeared every night, drifting through the mountains. From our homes in Springville, they looked like distant stars that defied the normal rules of astronomy, sometimes dancing, sometimes lingering motionless, and once, I swear, forming a perfect triangle above the highest peak. We never told our parents or reported it to anyone. Who would believe 4 teenagers? In Utah County, you quickly learn that some stories are best kept secret. Years later, Jake moved to California for college, Marcus enlisted in the Air Force, and Chris became an accountant in Salt Lake City. We rarely speak of that night, even when we meet up, but sometimes when I drive through the valley late at night, I glimpse lights in the mountains moving in ways that aren't quite right. Just last month, my 16-year-old nephew asked to borrow my camping gear to head into those same mountains. I agreed, but made him promise to take a good flashlight, not to keep the darkness at bay, but to signal if those lights reappear. Because here's what we never told anyone. Just before those lights split apart that night, before they raced off into the darkness, they arranged themselves in a pattern. The same pattern we had unwittingly created with our flashlights while goofing around outside the tent. They had been watching us long before we knew we were being watched. Sometimes I still dream of that night, of those perfect spheres dividing like cells, and I wonder, what if they aren't leaving at all, but multiplying? So next time you're camping near Springville, look up at the mountains on a clear night, count the lights that move in ways no star should, and you might just see that there are more of them every year. Redditor 6sec. New Mexico's highways have a way of lulling you into a trance if you're not careful. Miles of straight road through red earth and scrubland, shimmering heat waves on the horizon, and a sky so vast and intense it feels almost unreal. I'd driven this stretch of I-40 countless times, but that day in June 2018 was unlike any other. That was the day I nearly encountered aliens. Almost. I was heading east from Albuquerque to Amarillo for a sales conference, my car loaded with samples and promotional materials. The radio had surrendered to static an hour earlier, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. That's when I saw it, a flawless chrome sphere suspended in the cloudless sky. At first, I assumed it was a reflection, a stray glimmer from my watch or phone bouncing off the windshield. But when I shifted my position and checked from a different angle, the sphere remained, hovering about 5 miles away. It was unmistakably solid and metallic, catching the sunlight like a giant ball bearing in mid-air. I blinked, incredulous. "No way," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I had lived in New Mexico my whole life, heard all the stories. Roswell, Socorro, the Aztec incident. I'd scoffed at UFO enthusiasts and their trinkets. But now, I was witnessing something that defied explanation, an unidentified flying object pacing my car in broad daylight. My logical mind raced through possibilities. A drone? An experimental aircraft? An optical illusion? Yet drones are rarely perfect spheres. Military craft usually have visible propulsion, and an optical illusion wouldn't remain fixed relative to a moving vehicle for 20 minutes. My heart pounded. This was it, my moment. All those late nights watching documentaries and scouring UFO threads online had led me here. I, David Martinez, an ordinary medical supply salesman from Albuquerque, was on the cusp of UFO history. I imagined the headlines, "Local man captures definitive UFO evidence." I'd be on morning shows sharing my story with wide-eyed hosts. Perhaps History Channel would even make a documentary, leading to book deals, movie rights, and a sudden taste of fame. The next rest stop was imminent, so I carefully signaled and pulled over, trying to remain as composed as possible. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. I needed to capture the clearest, most convincing image of this phenomenon. I stepped out into the scorching June heat. The sphere still hung in the sky, gleaming against the deep blue. I held my breath, raised my phone and clicked. One photo, then another. A pickup truck thundered past, its driver giving me a puzzled look. I must have looked ridiculous, a man in a wrinkled dress shirt and tie, standing by the roadside photographing the heavens. But I was oblivious. I was making history. Back in the car, I could barely focus on driving. The sphere continued to pace me for another 10 miles before disappearing behind a line of hills. On the drive, I rehearsed my story. Should I contact local news first or go directly to national media? Perhaps MUFON? Would the men in black come knocking at my door? By the time I reached my hotel in Amarillo, I was practically buzzing with excitement. I rushed through check-in and locked myself in my room. With shaking fingers, I connected my phone to my laptop and downloaded the photos. The first image filled my screen, and my heart sank. Up close, it looked promising, a gleaming metallic dot against the blue backdrop. But as I zoomed in, the truth became painfully obvious. That perfect chrome sphere, which I had envisioned as an otherworldly vessel piloted by aliens, was nothing more than a weather balloon. A perfectly ordinary, thoroughly terrestrial, and utterly mundane weather balloon. I sat there for a long time staring at the image. The high-resolution photo revealed every detail. The slightly elongated base, the tether point, the characteristic surface texture any meteorologist would recognize instantly. It was ordinary. I closed my laptop and burst into laughter at myself. All those imagined headlines, rehearsed interviews, and dreams of sudden fame, all deflated as easily as a balloon. The next morning, while setting up my booth at the conference, a fellow vendor asked about my drive. "Uneventful," I replied, "just the usual." But that day, that chrome sphere taught me something important. For 20 minutes, I truly believed, lived in a world where the extraordinary seeped into the ordinary, where the mundane cracked open to reveal a realm of possibility. I still drive that stretch of I-40 for work, and sometimes I catch myself scanning the sky, half hoping for another glimpse of that chrome sphere. Not because I expect aliens this time, but because I miss that fleeting moment when the ordinary world suddenly became extraordinary. Just last week, while driving, I saw a distant light moving in a way that didn't quite add up. My heart began to race once more, but this time I didn't pull over or take a photo. I simply watched until it vanished behind the hills, content to let it remain a mystery. Maybe that's what we need, not proof of alien life or secret government experiments, but those precious moments when the world seems full of impossible possibilities. Those rare intervals when the everyday cracks open and reveals something magical. So if you ever find yourself driving through eastern New Mexico on a clear day and you spot something odd in that endless blue sky, let your imagination run wild. Snap a photo, dream of the headlines. Feel your heart race at the thought of discovery. Just remember to check the weather balloon launch schedule before you call the History Channel. P.S. I did post one of the photos on Reddit. It got a dozen upvotes and a comment pointing out it was clearly a weather balloon. Sometimes the mundane truth is less captivating than our dreams, but that moment of wonder remains undeniably real. Redditor 7. I never should have taken that summer security job at Edwards Air Force Base. The pay was decent, better than most college jobs, but some experiences are priceless, and what I saw during those midnight shifts still haunts me, especially on nights when the moon hangs low over the desert like it did back then. I grew up in Lancaster, only a few miles from the base. Everyone knew about Edwards. The sonic booms from test floats rattled windows at all hours. But we also knew of Boron, a tiny town living in the base's shadow. Its own legends whispered at high school parties and over late-night diner chats. During my senior year, I joined a ride-along with the base police as part of a school program. That's when the seeds of curiosity were planted. The officers told us strange stories, details I dismissed at the time as attempts to impress a group of teenagers. They mentioned underground hangars beneath the dry lake bed, experimental aircraft that defied known physics, and even a base within the base that no one was allowed to enter. What stuck with me most was the fire protocol. According to them, if certain buildings' fire alarms went off, the firefighters were instructed to stay outside the gates and simply watch as they burned. I laughed then, but now I know better. 5 years later, I was back at Edwards, this time with a freshly minted security clearance and assigned to night shifts on the outer perimeter. The job was simple: monitor the cameras, perform hourly patrols, and report anything unusual. At Edwards, unusual turned out to be a very flexible term. My first month was uneventful. Desert nights were quiet except for the occasional coyote or the distant rumble of routine aircraft tests. But then, during my 6th week on a moonless Tuesday night, things changed. I was on my 2 a.m. patrol along the eastern edge where the base met the vast dry lake bed. The radio crackled with routine check-ins. As I reached to respond, something caught my eye. A faint light emerging deep in the lake bed, where no light should exist. It wasn't the harsh white of landing lights or the red of warning beacons. It was a pale blue glow emanating from beneath the cracked earth, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat and seeming to rise. I switched off my vehicle's lights and watched. Meanwhile, my radio erupted into a cascade of white noise that grew louder as I neared the source. Amid the static, I could just make out voices speaking urgently, though the words were unintelligible. Then I saw them, figures moving around the source of that light. They weren't in standard Air Force uniforms, nor were they in the hazmat suits I'd occasionally seen. Their suits looked otherworldly, shifting, rippling as if made of liquid metal in the eerie blue glow. I reached for my phone to capture the moment, but it was dead, not merely low on battery, but completely unresponsive. At the same time, my vehicle's dashboard went haywire, gauges spinning wildly. The engine stalled, leaving me stranded about 100 yards from the spectacle. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the air, growing to an almost unbearable pitch. The blue light intensified dramatically, forcing me to shield my eyes. When I dared look again, something massive was emerging from the lake bed. An impossible shape, its surface folding in on itself in ways that defied geometry. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, my radio cleared and a sharp voice came through. Delta 7 return to base immediately. Repeat, Delta 7 return to base immediately. Confirm receipt. My hands trembled as I restarted the vehicle, which mysteriously came back to life and sped away. In my rearview mirror, I caught one final glimpse. The figures in those shifting suits were watching me, and above them, that indescribable shape loomed, towering as high as a 10-story building. I broke several speed limits in my haste back to the main security office. When I arrived, my supervisor and 2 men in black suits I'd never seen intercepted me. They confiscated my badge, had me sign a slew of non-disclosure agreements, and informed me that my employment was terminated immediately. Before I left, my supervisor pulled me aside. "Whatever you think you saw out there," he said slowly, "you didn't see. And if you did, you must forget it. Consider that night erased." I transferred the next week. Shortly afterward, Sarah broke up with me. Last I heard, I was reassigned to a post in the Arctic, as far from New Brunswick as possible. Sometimes, on late shifts, I catch myself gazing at the stretch of highway visible from the base's north tower. On clear nights, you can see the hill where it all happened. I've never seen any strange lights there since, but I have noticed something odd. No local ever ventures down that hiking trail anymore. The parking lot has been officially closed for years, the entrance blocked with concrete. Yet every now and then, I hear whispers from passing travelers, tales of mysterious lights in the hills, of missing time, of men in black suits asking unsettling questions. I keep my mouth shut about it. Some stories, I believe, are best left unspoken. But I still have a piece of chrome from that parking lot stowed away in my footlocker. A constant reminder that it wasn't all a dream, that somewhere out there, above the hills of New Brunswick, something is watching. And sometimes it does more than simply watch. Redditor 8. I used to think amateur astronomy was the most peaceful pastime. Just me, my telescope, and the endless void of space, free of deadlines or drama. That was before I started seeing things that shouldn't exist. Before the lights began following me home. It started on a crisp Tuesday night in October. The air was perfectly cool, a treat rather than a trial for stargazing. I had just finished calibrating my new Celestron, a splurge I'd justified as an early Christmas present to myself, and was carefully focusing on the moon's terminator, where light meets shadow. The cratered surface was mesmerizing, each ridge and valley etched in stunning detail. When I pulled back from the eyepiece to check my astronomy app on my phone, something caught my peripheral vision, a tiny pinpoint of light darting across the sky. I assumed it was a satellite and mentally noted to check its trajectory later. But then, it did something impossible. The light came to an abrupt halt, as though it had slammed into an invisible barrier. Then, it made a perfect 90-degree turn, as if space itself had folded like a sheet of paper. My hands began shaking as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to record the moment. But by the time I opened the camera app, it was gone. I tried to rationalize it, a trick of the light, an atmospheric anomaly, perhaps my eyes playing tricks after too long at the telescope. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen was fundamentally wrong, like witnessing a fish somehow walking on dry land. A week later, while walking my German Shepherd Max on our familiar late-night route, I saw it again. At first, it appeared as any other satellite, a steady point of light moving across the sky. But then its movement became erratic. It wobbled, like a spinning top about to collapse, then jerked abruptly, coming to unexpected stops. No natural object behaves like that. No man-made object either. I forgot my cigarette, its ember melting between my fingers, as I stared up in awe. Max began whining, a low, persistent sound I'd never heard before. Glancing down, I saw his ears pinned back and his gaze fixed upward at the same patch of sky. The light continued its impossible dance until it neared a bright star. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it extinguished like a snuffed-out candle. That's when the dreams began. Every night, the same eerie sequence. I peer through my telescope, but instead of the familiar celestial bodies, I see an eye, a non-human eye. Its pupil an unsettling vertical slit. Sometimes I try to tear away from the eyepiece, but I'm frozen, unable to move, and sometimes, when the eye blinks, I wake up drenched in sweat. I stopped using the telescope after that, but it didn't matter. The lights seemed to follow me now, even on my commute, performing an impossible ballet above the morning traffic. Strangely, no one else ever seemed to notice, or if they did, they acted as if nothing were amiss. Was I the only one witnessing this? Last night, something was different. I was taking out the trash when I noticed a light, closer than ever before. It wasn't just a light at all. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the night sky, a window into somewhere else, and I felt as if something was looking back through that window. I dropped the trash bag and ran inside, but not before I heard a sound like a blend of radio static and whale song, forming words. "We've been watching, too." Now, as I sit writing this, I still hear that strange sound echoing in my mind. My telescope remains packed away under a sheet in the corner, but sometimes I swear I can hear it humming softly, as if it's calling out to me, or perhaps something else is speaking through it. Max no longer goes near that corner. He now sits by the window, eyes fixed on the sky with a look that makes my skin crawl. Occasionally, his ears twitch as if he hears something I can't, and he emits that same low whine. And then there's the stars themselves, patterns I've never noticed before, shifting subtly in ways that defy natural motion. It's like watching a vast net being drawn taut, trapping us all within its threads. I have tried discussing this with other amateur astronomers online, but my posts keep disappearing. The few responses I've received are odd, as if written by something pretending to be human, yet missing crucial details. Tonight, the lights are back, drawing intricate geometric shapes above my house that burn themselves into my vision even when I close my eyes. I suspect they're trying to convey something, or perhaps show me something. I should probably pack away my telescope, move to a place where light pollution makes stargazing impossible, but I know it wouldn't matter. They've noticed that I noticed them, and I don't think they'll ever let me look away. So I keep watching, keep documenting, hoping that someone else out there is seeing what I see and maybe has figured out what it all means. Just, if you own a telescope, think twice before pointing it at the heavens. Some things out there might not appreciate being observed. After all, sometimes when you look up at the stars, it feels like the stars are looking back at you. Redditor 9. Working security at CFB Gagetown meant enduring long, uneventful nights punctuated by the occasional drunken soldier trying to sneak back after curfew. But that night in '82 stands out vividly. It was the first time I saw true fear etched in a soldier's eyes. Jack and Sarah had left just after sunset to catch a showing of Tron in St. John. It was about an hour's drive, and they were buzzing with excitement for their date. Jack had been raving about the movie for weeks, something about computers coming to life. I remember waving them off from my post, hearing Sarah's laughter as they drove off in Jack's once pristine blue Chevrolet. The night shift settled into its routine. I made my rounds, checking the perimeter, when suddenly I heard tires screeching on asphalt. The clock read 9:43 p.m. Far too early for anyone returning. The car that pulled up next looked unrecognizable. Its once shiny paint was now a jumbled mess of red, green, white, and black, like it had been through a demolition derby. The passenger side mirror dangled by its wires, and the front bumper was crumpled like a discarded aluminum can. But it was the look on their faces that stopped me cold. Jack gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sarah sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed straight ahead, with makeup streaked by tears. When I asked what had happened, Jack just shook his head and mumbled something about taking Sarah home. They then walked away in a daze, leaving the wrecked car as evidence of something inexplicable. For 3 days, Jack avoided me. He reported for duty, did his job, but whenever anyone mentioned that night, he'd vanish. Finally, after half a bottle of whiskey in my quarters, he confided everything. They had been driving along Route 7A stretch with nothing but pine trees and darkness. The movie theater was still 20 minutes away when they rounded a bend and saw strange, colorful lights on a hillside. Lights in a place where none should be. At the base of the hill was a small parking area for hikers, marked with an arrow-shaped sign. They weren't alone. Half a dozen other cars had pulled in, their occupants clustering and pointing upward. Jack said he felt an irresistible pull toward the lights, like everyone else did. They all began walking toward the trail that led up the hill. That's when it appeared. It was like a spotlight ignited inside my brain, Jack recalled, his hands shaking as he reached for his drink. But the light wasn't coming from above. It was coming from something, a disc, just hovering over the hill. And the sound, God, the sound! It was like 1,000 dentist drills all screaming at once. What followed was chaos. Everyone scrambled for their cars, but the parking lot had only one narrow exit. In the ensuing mayhem, cars crashed, paint was scraped off, mirrors shattered, and metal screamed against metal. Jack said he'd never witnessed such raw terror, more than he'd ever seen in basic training or combat exercises. They managed to get back to base in record time, pushing the car's engine to its limits. Jack wouldn't share more that night, but a week later he took me back to the parking lot. There, I saw remnants of the chaos, chunks of chrome, shattered glass, and strips of rubber, proof that something inexplicable had occurred. Then the men in black showed up. They arrived in a sleek black Lincoln Continental with government plates, though I couldn't identify the agency. Two of the men went straight to Jack's quarters, where he spent 3 agonizing hours. When he emerged, he looked as if he'd aged 10 years. At the mess hall that evening, I asked him quietly, what did they want? He glanced around nervously and whispered, listen carefully. If you value your career, if you value your life, you must never speak of what happened that night. That night never happened. Jack requested a transfer the following week. Soon after, Sarah broke up with him. Last I heard, he was stationed in the Arctic, far away from New Brunswick. Sometimes, on late shifts, I find myself gazing at the stretch of highway visible from the base's north tower. On clear nights, the hill where it all happened is visible. I've never seen any strange lights there since, but I've noticed one odd thing. No one from the area ever uses that hiking trail anymore. The parking lot has been closed for years, the entrance sealed with concrete. Yet, every so often, travelers passing through share hushed stories of mysterious lights on that hill, of missing time, of men in black suits asking unsettling questions. I keep quiet about these stories. Some nights, I think, are better left unremembered. But I still have a piece of chrome from that parking lot hidden in my footlocker, a reminder that it wasn't a dream, that somewhere above the hills of New Brunswick, something is watching. And sometimes it does more than just watch.